Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Discomfort-Zone podcast. I'm Olev. If the sound volumes or anything are off, please let me know. If you can hear okay, then that's wonderful. Welcome, everyone who's in chat. Dunstable, good to see you here. And Rondon, of course. Okay, I always forget this. I'm going to start by saying that all of the opinions and ideas that are expressed in this show are my own and they don't represent MSP Waves or anyone else for that fact. So, this week I actually was thinking, following a few episodes back, I've been meaning to talk about the cryptocurrency side of the ecoVillage, and as I said, I'm not knowledgeable enough in that area in order to do it on my own. So I'm going to carry on researching, and I've had a few people approach me about joining the show, so I'm going to see how I do that. But this week was insane. I actually didn't have time to do anything, so I didn't get around to doing it. But instead, this week's episode is called Surviving the Apocalypse. And so that's a rather clickbaity title. Oh, good to see everyone, Peachy and Neil. I don't think I've seen you before. Good to have you here. What I mean by surviving the apocalypse, what I want to talk about today a little bit, is actually the way in which the eco-village model can help us with facing an uncertain future. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the idea behind that is and how we can actually take that view and use it in other areas in our life, and also to give some real examples. And I've got a few things that I want to get through, so we'll see how far we make it down the list. But if I don't make it for anything, we'll see. Maybe we'll make up for it next week. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Now, when I talk about preparing for the future and being able basically to face whatever challenges may come, this is a viewpoint that I'd been thinking about long before, obviously, but there's a book that I read by a man called Ben Falk. And Ben Falk is a permaculturist, and he also deals with a lot of the same ideas that I talked about in keyline farming. He has a farm in America, in Vermont, where it gets very cold, and he deals a lot with cold climate and short growing periods, etc. So it's a bit different from the situation that we're in. But one of the things that he talks about that really caught my attention was his term resilience, and basically the idea of developing as much resilience in your system as possible. So specifically when we talk about farming and homesteading, we can think of it in a few different ways. And I think most of the systems that have been in place and most of the things that as a society we've been doing is trying to create the perfect system, trying to create a system that functions at optimum ability, and that obviously has a very good return for investment, whether it's energy or economically, and really developing these systems and improving them to become the best that they are. Now, this model, which is a very scientific model, and it's a very useful model, it's a model that we see bring forth so many of the technologies that we have, but it's a model that I'm not sure if it exists in nature per se, but there's definitely a competing model that nature utilizes, which is nature takes a system that isn't developed, a system that is actually very fragile, and it allows that system to grow. And this doesn't matter, we can talk about organisms and we can talk about ecosystems. The fact of the matter is that everything in nature seems to start off in its least developed state, which makes sense. And when we come into this world, we're very helpless, and compared to our abilities that we can have, we certainly are far away from our potential. And this system sort of invites us to think about it in a different way. Instead of trying to reach that end result as quickly as possible, so instead of trying to perfect a system by working on it and by developing it and by trying and testing it in order to get it to an optimum state as quickly as possible, with nature there's sort of less of a focus on a specific part and more an attempt to be, I'll use that term, as resilient as possible. Meaning when a baby is growing or when a system is learning in nature, it's learning so many different things all the time. Unlike a technology where we have a certain problem that we're trying to solve, the technology is very, very focused on that specific area, and you try to utilize it for that specific area as best as you can. With nature, there's very often a lot of different areas that can be developed, and it really is the environment and the situation and the stimulus that whatever the system is comes across that defines and really shapes how that system develops. And this is a very different way of thinking about developing systems and about creating these sort of ideas. When we talk about homesteading, and this is what Ben Folt talks about in his book, he talks about starting a system that's very, very small, that's very, very simple, and that is really sort of to test the waters. And once you have a very small, simple system in place, very quickly you can see some problems that will arise or some improvements that you can make. And you can make those improvements with very little undoing of work or very little cost. And then those improvements can help the system to grow and become more sophisticated over time. And this is obviously, you can apply this thought to anything that you want to start from nothing and develop in the way that it can be the most adapted to its environment. And so this term resilience can mean two different things, really. One of them is this ability to grow and develop in reaction to the environment and to be able to learn from the environment and to take that as part of its experience to grow further. But there's also another side to this resilience, it comes from the same place. It's developed at the same time. And that is the ability to deal with change. And so when we talk about growing, what we're actually talking about is changing over time. And whether you're growing or you're, as it were, staying in one place, we're constantly changing. And if you attempt to stay in one place, you're growing in a certain direction, or you can say, you're developing in a certain direction. So when we're talking about a system that we're trying to develop, we really want to make sure that we are allowing the system to interact with the environment as sort of openly and obviously within safe regions, but allowing it to be exposed to the environment that'll shape it. And that exposure is something that can lead to a skill with dealing with change. So I want to give a very quick real world example from my personal life. I think I've mentioned it a few times, but my wife and I, we had a son 11 months ago. And he is, well, I won't talk about him too much because I could go on for hours, but one of the very, very fascinating and I think, privileges is watching a human being from birth grow and develop into what we call an adult. And it's a very intriguing process, and obviously there's a lot to learn and a lot I could talk about, but this issue of resilience in the face or as an outcome of exposure to the environment. We seem to have a tendency in society, at least from my experience until now, of really shielding babies and covering them up all the time and covering their extremities and really, in a way, sealing them off from the environment. Now, obviously, this is needed to a certain degree because they need that shielding from the environment, but this tendency can become imbalanced. And with our son, I think consciously and also intuitively, we felt that a certain amount of exposure was very, very healthy, and that lack of exposure could really lead to some kind of slowing or underdevelopment. Obviously, we're not talking about causing real damage, but a small example would be the babies, usually their clothes, their legs have feet that close over, you know, like not like a sock, but the whole onesie. And as soon as you have that, especially have like a pair of socks underneath and then another thick layer of warm clothing, you can see that babies have no sensory information coming from their feet. And when they don't have that sensory information, their feet don't react to the environment and don't develop in the same way and don't grow. Obviously, this doesn't mean that they never develop, but there is a clear correlation between exposure to stimulation and growth. And so with our son, I think we really saw it when he was walking, or not walking, but crawling, and he was starting to stand and starting to sort of walk holding onto something. And then we moved here to Portugal, where it was winter and much colder than it was, and he had to start wearing socks all the time. And as soon as he started wearing socks, he had a much harder time walking. You could see that it was taking him back in his ability and his development. So what we're trying to do, I feel, and I think that we're doing it to a certain extent, is allowing him to be exposed to as much of the environment as is healthy, let's say. And you can see a clear correlation that the more you expose him to different things, the more stimulation that he receives, whether it's from people or from the environment or even games, it really does cause this level of growth and this development to happen. And I think, I mean, it's obviously very early to tell, but in my experience, when you are more accustomed to dealing with new environments, to reacting to the environment and seeing how you can, utilize it and coexist, you become much better at being able to deal with change and being able to assimilate change and use it to your advantage. And I really feel that this is what is important to develop in any kind of system, especially when we're talking about a system like the ecoVillage or a homestead. You want the system to be able to withstand certain and sudden changes. For example, a drought that can suddenly hit. I just watched a very interesting video the other day by Jeff Lawton, who's a famous permaculturist. And he said that they just finished 12 months without rain. And for those 12 months, obviously, their ponds and their reservoirs were drying up and they were getting very close to being empty. But the fact is, he did have enough water on the land for everything to look completely lush and green, even after a year with no rain. So that's a system that's very, very resilient. If the system receives a lot of rain, and indeed after that drought, the video was showing him when they'd had a torrential rain, I think a few days of almost non-stop, all that rain coming at one time can be very, very dangerous. And a lot of different systems, a lot of different farms really suffer when they have these sort of downpours, especially if they come after a long time of drought where the earth is really dried up and not capable of dealing with so much water. But on Jeff Lawton's farm, because of the way it's structured, it's designed to be able to handle a large volume of water in a very short amount of time. And in the video, he was going around and sort of opening up the valves to start emptying some of the overflow because all of the reservoirs were already filling up one after the other and there was more rain expected. But no matter how much rain it comes, once the system is full and the land is completely saturated, the water won't cause any harm, it won't cause any problems because the system is designed to be able to deal with it. And so that's what I really mean when I talk about resilience in the system. And it's something that's very important to develop in order to withstand these sudden changes that obviously happen. Now, we could easily learn from this on ourselves and see that I think there are certain people who are more comfortable with change, and often those people who are more comfortable with change are less comfortable with routine and with monotony, and obviously vice versa. And so I think that when people are afraid of change, when people feel that they're in a comfortable zone that they really don't want to leave, that can sometimes hinder growth. And although some changes are very hard to deal with, some changes can be very painful, often, at least in my experience, that change does lead to a period of growth and a period of development, which ultimately leads to better places that come. So I at least feel in my experience that whenever I've had some very big shift or very big change that comes and surprises me, and I find it difficult to sort of let go of what I knew before that's no more, after I accept it and I deal with it and I process with it after some time goes by, it really does lead to a newfound sense of achievement or development, or feeling that I really moved forward and that I got something from that period that I couldn't have developed without that change and without that obstacle that I had to deal with. So that was all over the place a little bit, but it's this concept of resilience, which is something that I don't often hear being spoken about very specifically. And so Ben Folk in his book talks about resilience in many different areas, but he also sort of lists a few problems that could come. And this is really where the idea for the name of the episode being Surviving the Apocalypse. Obviously, apocalypse can mean many different things, and there are many sudden changes that are impossible to deal with. If a tsunami is coming at 600 kilometers per hour, besides running or trying to get somewhere that's high enough, there's very little that you can do to deal with it. So obviously the term apocalypse encapsulates a lot more than what we could really plan for. But having said that, there are many dangers and many situations that could arise that we can be more ready for and we can try and plan for. And this is somewhat of a different area of the ecoVillage model, because it's not sort of just practical application or the sociological studies of how can this model improve our day-to-day life, but it is something that I think is a big part of it. In my personal life and in my personal experience, I've felt that there are very often these sudden changes throughout history that we've seen that people weren't prepared for. And I think it's a certain mentality, a certain part of the human psychology that people are really not very ready to face changes that are going to come, or to see the early signs of change that always are around in reality. When historians look back and when we look back and say, how could they be so blind, and how couldn't they have done something before to prevent this awful thing? Many instances we see that there's something about the human psyche that blinds us to realities we don't want to deal with. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about a hot topic, which I hope no one will be too offended by, but remember, these are just my opinions. As some of you know, I lived in Israel until very recently. And I think Israel is a prime example of a place where so often you see clear problems. No, it doesn't matter what any denomination you are, whether it's, what religious side, what political affiliation, nothing. You can clearly see there are certain problems, and yet there is this air of agreement among many people in Israel that, you shouldn't criticize, you shouldn't think about it. There's nothing wrong. Everything's okay. We have blind faith that the situation will somehow resolve itself. And the most important thing, we really don't need to do anything to change it. And that's a very scary mindset for me to see in people, where we can see what happens when things can go unchecked for too long. And it's certainly a danger that I wish more people were at least more willing to talk about, whether or not there's anything we can do or whatever, but at least to be aware that, this is actually could grow to a pretty big problem down the line if we don't deal with it. So I guess we'll see over the next few decades if I was paranoid or, if there was something there. But to our point, and it doesn't matter where you are, talking specifically about the ecoVillage model, it was very important for me to see a solution or to see some way of dealing with some of the dangers that I thought could arise in the future. And having the ecoVillage model possibly answer these and obviously offer a solution that is harmonious and that goes hand in hand with everything that we've talked about. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about these dangers that I personally am, trying to plan for and see how the ecoVillage can answer them. So before I go on, I just want to say if there are any questions or anything that I've spoken about or whatever, I'm just going to check through chat very quickly because I didn't see. Okay. Oh, thank you, Crimson Clad. I'm glad you're enjoying. Wow, I wish you all the best of luck fighting the Quebec tax because, red tape is, we're dealing with that now as well. Okay, Crimson Clad says that unfortunately she won't be doing a show this evening because of a pile of code review and technical stuff that simply can't be put off. Okay. This is, thank you very much, Crimson Clad, for mentioning. So, I'll move forward, and if you have any questions along the line, I'll make sure to check every now and again. So, there's this list of things that is made up of problems that can arise that we can deal with it. So, I think one of the main concerns and something that really is going on today already is this problem of pollution. Now, we can break up pollution in a few different areas, and it's something very real that I think as a society we really have to start talking about and thinking about. And so we'll talk about air pollution, for example. There's this sort of, notion that I don't think many people hold, but somehow on the higher levels of business and government, there seems to be this notion that air is local, that if you've got air over there or air over here, they're separate. And obviously this isn't the case, and we've seen a few disasters in past years, whether it's volcanic ash or just factory pollution traveling from one location and really causing many problems all over. And so air pollution today is already so much worse, and obviously if you're in a city it'll be worse than a country, but it's important to remember that Earth is a closed system. The same air and the same water gets circulated and have been circulating, for a long, long time. So when we think about air pollution, we really need to consider a system that will be able to deal with pollution at least to a certain degree. And I'm not going to give any numbers or figures of, scientifically speaking, what cubic, centimeter of, what do you call it, ppd of carbon we need to get rid of. Forget any of that. What we need to focus on is how does nature deal with this pollution? And I believe that the solution to our problem will be found in the natural systems that have developed and that have developed ways of dealing with these problems. And so when we talk about air pollution, there's one thing, ppm, thank you, Abdi, yeah, I forgot about it, parts per million. There's one organism that I think is more responsible for creating the air that we use, and that is trees. Obviously many different kinds of trees, and trees are different varieties, have different capabilities, but generally speaking, with any farm that wants to be dealing with a natural environment, trees are going to be a very, very crucial part of that system. And so, we can see the results of cutting down so many forests and jungles around the planet, and that loss of trees and loss of the ability to process carbon dioxide and to release oxygen, is really having its effects now, increasing as we carry on cutting them down. So obviously on a global scale, there isn't much that we can do personally, but if the eco-village model catches on, and each of these models, most of the land is designated as a food forest to a certain degree. The idea is to have this completely enveloping forest all around, bearing fruit, at least for part of it. And the eco-village, the people, the buildings are sort of interspersed in between. Because I really believe that's the way we're meant to live, whether it's, an open plain or whatever. Having these trees around us really does change the air on a very basic level. And I think that's definitely something that we should be hoping to strive towards anywhere that we are in the world. So obviously, when we talk about air pollution worldwide, if there's a massive influx in whatever it is, there might not be anything we can do. But the way to do whatever we can to provide resilience to a system is to provide as much of the air that we're using on our own, just like we do with everything else. And so having trees is going to be a crucial part to that. I can see that we're getting close to the halfway mark, so I'm going to go through a few more pollutants and then we'll see what other problems we can tackle. Next is water pollution, and it's a clear correlation and parallel between air and water, except that water does have a feeling of being local because we can see it. And so we know when there's a rain cloud, we can see individual drops of rain falling and hitting the ground. But obviously that water is still coming from somewhere. And when the water is polluted, that pollution, certain pollutions, can even be carried on through the rain. So really, when we're talking about dealing with water, the idea is to have the whole site, the whole farm, the whole eco-village as one giant water treatment system. And so the water treated will be used for different things, and based on the usage, it will be filtered to different degrees, meaning obviously plants won't need as much filtration as drinking water. But nevertheless, every particle of water that lands on the eco-village has to be dealt with as a particle that needs to come into interaction with the system. So if any of you have heard about Victor Schauberger, he was an Austrian, if I'm not mistaken, an Austrian, well, he was actually a ranger, a forest ranger, and he came from a line of forest rangers. But he studied water, and I think, in my experience, he's one of the people who understands water possibly more than anyone else. He's a fascinating character. He's very unique, I should say. But whenever we see these characters who sort of didn't go to school and suggested crazy theories that went completely against what modern science said, it's interesting to see practical applications and whether they succeeded or failed. And in the case of Victor Schauberger, he successfully managed to erect a log flume, which is, let's say, a device to carry logs from where they're cut in the forest down a waterway to where they can be shipped off, basically. And so he designed the longest log flume until then, and all the scientists said it wouldn't work, and obviously it was a great success. And I think that's a sign of the fact that he wasn't just a crazy old man, but that he actually knew what he was talking about. So Victor Schauberger talks about water as an organism, and he's certainly not alone in this, but he talks about the organism going through a different progress, a different state of development. And it starts with sort of rainwater, where in his claiming, and I'm not going to say that that's my personal opinion, but he says that water is actually not healthy to be drunk as pure rainwater straight from the sky. Water has this property of basically attracting different chemicals and different particles to it. And rainwater is at its most virgin state, as it were, and so it sucks out nutrients from anything that it comes across. This is scientifically proven. The fact that water at its purest state, meaning as close to H2O as you can get, becomes tremendously absorbent to the state that if you get it on your body somewhere, it can actually leach out nutrients. So rainwater, when it falls, it's in its very virgin state, and because of that, it actually needs to go through the process of being part of the forest system. And so Victor Schauberger says that all water is born in the forest. Excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold. The water basically lands on the earth and gets filtrated, and as it goes through the process of filtration through the ground and comes into interaction with the organisms and with the minerals, it changes its properties. It changes what it's made of, from pure H2O, as it were, to, you know, a messy, life-filled molecule. And at this state, it comes out to a spring or to some body of water where it comes above ground. And this is the state that Victor Schauberger says is the best quality of water, the most filled with life. Now, that's sort of one system that we can look at. The application of that is, I can't actually remember, I didn't find the link to this. I'll try and remember to put it up on the post. But there is someone who developed a filtration system which is basically made up of earth and plants. Now, this is utilized in many different places, and it's utilized in the Earthship, but it was interesting how he sort of took this very, very specific system and utilized it just for taking wastewater and filtering it out to drinking water. And it went through these 4 very, very large containers of different varieties of plants, and it trickled through the earth. And at the end of that process, you could see that the water that was coming out was clean water. So this isn't something new. This isn't something very secret. It's something that we need to apply when we're planning the water system. And it's something that's a very big part of the ecoVillage model. However you look at it, when water falls on the earth, it's going through a process of filtration. And our ability to design the land to best process it and to allow it to be used for multiple different uses down the line is going to make sure that we can provide clean water from any source that we're given. Now, this is obviously to a certain extent, but I do believe that nature has the tools to process any of the toxins that we know. So it's certainly something that can be done. I see Rondon said looking clean and being clean may be 2 different things. Absolutely. I mean, you know, obviously if you believe him, but he did say that he tested the water to see what rate it was. And I mean, it is possible to filter water to a state where it goes from being unhealthy to being drinking water. I didn't personally test his design, so I obviously can't say, but I do know for a fact that it is possible. That design specifically was one example, but absolutely, when you're dealing with water, and especially drinking water and even washing water, etc., it's absolutely crucial to have it tested and to see if there's anything that obviously the naked eye doesn't catch. And for us as well in the ecoVillage, once you have a water system set up, it has to be continually tested. And I know of so many people who've had water that they use be contaminated, and sometimes it takes a few weeks to even notice. So yeah, it's very messy stuff. You don't want to mess around with water that you're drinking, definitely. So we talked about air pollution and water pollution. Now, one more pollution that I think is just worth mentioning because it also is prevalent today, although many people I think are very aware of this, is earth and food pollution. And so this is usually when it gets into the food, it comes in through the earth, and whether it's different chemicals that people use to grow, or whether it's just chemicals that are found in the area, this is certainly a danger that we can see happening around the world today, and could very well increase and become more of a problem in future. And so the solution to is probably of all of the pollutants, this is one of the easiest, is growing our own food. And if we're using the water that we talked about and have this land that we're growing things on, that obviously is going to be very easy, well, relatively easy to do. Hang on. So I've got a bit of a chat here. Rondon said, I doubt water in like China or India would be good for you after filtering it through dirt. I mean, I'll tell you what, we should really test it. But as far as I know from what I've seen, there are many methods of filtration, but not just through dirt. So when you talk about like, clay or gravel or, rocks, those are certain filtrations, usually for larger sized particles, but the real detoxifying effect is achieved through the organisms, and it's through plants and their roots coming into action, and obviously the microorganisms that are there as well. So I do want to specify that it's not just filtering through inorganic material, dirt or whatever, but it's actually the organisms that are doing the filtration. And if we're speaking about organisms that are doing filtration, I have to just mention one more thing very quickly, which is fungi. And so there are many, there's an entire field called mycoremediation, meaning remediating, healing the environment using mycology, using mushrooms. And so fungi are tremendously effective at being able to withdraw and to process toxins of all different natures. And I have more to talk about that later, so I won't go into it too much now. But definitely, if there are toxins or dangerous chemicals that plants are not able to filter, there are organisms, there are different types of mushrooms that will be able to process it. There's so many I can't even start mentioning, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. How are we doing for time? Okay. Okay, so I'll see what I managed to get through today, and if we don't manage anything in this show, I'll carry it over to the next one. Kyle says most of the water tables are fucked with microplastics and chemicals. That is indeed true. And speaking of microplastics, that's a type of pollution that is very, very prevalent, completely, I think, under announced, and people aren't aware of it. And it does need special treatment. So you know what? Thank you very much for the comment. I'm actually going to write that down. I'm going to deal with the microplastics next week, because I think it's a huge subject that not many people have heard about, and it really is something worth mentioning. Patient Zero says, oh yeah, microplastics are nutritious. Yeah, don't be racist against them. They're just like big plastics. No. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to a few other things that I wanted to mention with a little time that I have left. Okay, sorry, I keep checking on things in the chat. So the next thing I want to talk about, moving on from pollution in general, and there's obviously a lot more to say about that and a lot more to talk about different processing techniques, but another real, I think, danger that a lot of people are not aware of is what I'll simply call grid failure. And obviously grid can mean many different things, but we'll talk specifically about the electrical grid. So I am no electrician, and I'm certainly no expert when it comes to large-scale grids. But from what I've understood and from what many of the experts say, the actual grid that we have in place for most of society's working electricity today is not very stable. It's interesting to see that we experience this with blackouts or with certain power cuts, just with whatever, bad weather or these different things. But I'm talking about much larger scale. And we've seen in history these examples of solar flares being caused by the sun that can result in these major blackouts over large areas. And it's something that I think is really worth paying attention to, because the solution to that, and indeed the problem, is a much larger ordeal. And the grid system and the electrical grid is a symptom of this whole problem that we have with centralization. The problem that we have with it, meaning there are certain problems that arise once you try to centralize systems, and the susceptibility of the system to sudden changes is certainly one of the more important factors for me to consider. So when we're talking about the eco-village system, even on an eco-village scale, it's very, very important that there is not one main electrical grid that sort of provides power for everything. And I say that because I've seen this model in some small eco-villages or communities, and it's something that I think people maybe don't realize or don't think about, because it's a much cheaper solution, where you just have most of the money pooled together for one large system and then taking that power and sending it out to wherever it needs to go. The problem with that is the same problem of centralization. If there's a problem with that system, there's a problem with all of the electricity in the community. And so with the eco-village, it's crucial that every individual power, let's say, power using unit, which could be somebody's house, or it could be the kitchen, or it could be the communal office, or whatever, has its own power source. And the good thing about that system is not just does it actually become a more resilient system, where if one of the systems has a problem, or even if two or three have a problem, there's still a chance that the other systems will be able to work. But on top of that, there's also something else that's much better, which is you can actually design a system that's more suitable, that's more well adapted to the specific need. And so if you have one system that's providing for everything, you're going to have a much, much bigger system. And then every house will sort of be using what it needs. But then your division of the electricity is going to be sort of much more complicated, as it were. And that just means that there's more of the system that can go wrong, or that can be, out of whack if suddenly one of the houses has a much higher consumption of power. This affects the amount of power available for the whole rest of the system. Whereas when you have the individualized systems, each house that uses it can actually construct it and work with it based on its own needs. So this is also true on an eco-village level, and obviously society today at large. When we just had a ridiculous storm a few weeks ago, and the power was out for 12 hours from 10 o'clock at night until the next morning. Now it's funny that obviously the way that I live my life right now and everything, my phone didn't have a lot of battery, and I was really stumped because you don't even have light, so you can't even read a book. I had to start lighting candles everywhere. But it just goes to show how susceptible the system is. And as Leela, my wife, told me the next day when she went to meet some friends, the woman who was off grid had power throughout the night, and she was the only one in the group. So that was a real lesson for me, a real world example of how these problems can actually result in affecting our lives, sometimes more largely than we may have considered before. Okay, so I can see we've got 15 minutes left. I can do one more problem that we can face, or if anyone has any questions or you'd rather talk about one of the subjects, then we can do that as well. Kyle says, internet goes down globally for 3 days, we're all fucked. Complete social breakdown, societal breakdown. Absolutely. If you've heard of George Carlin's one before, Life is Worth Losing. That's what the show was called, if anyone can find a copy. His opening monologue, I think it's his opening monologue if I'm not mistaken. One of the monologues that he has here is about the electricity going down. And he sort of goes on to describe how quickly a dystopian state would arise from just as it were, having no electricity. Yeah, my internet is out, my PC becomes a paperweight. Absolutely. It's interesting. And these, a solar flare, or what we've all learned from the Matrix, and EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, can quickly, destroy electronics beyond repair. And it's a frightening thought when so much of our lives depends on it. Absolutely. Yeah, shelves are empty in like 2 days. After that, the zombie apocalypse starts. However, it's not zombies eating people, it's people eating people. It's a scary thought, and I think that society is so fragile at its state right now. And so much of that is because, as you say, people don't have food, water, electricity if the government isn't providing it for them. And so if this one system falls, it's, everything. We saw there's been obviously different cataclysmic events, but I think it was in New York where there was a huge snowstorm that, never mind the people even, I think some people even died because of the cold, but it was a complete city blackout for I can't remember how long it was. And I can imagine, how scary it is to be in that situation where really your only reference is like horror films and dystopian sci-fi movies where, I don't know, the phone's dead, there's no internet, you can't contact, you don't know what's going on. I mean, it's like scary. Yeah, we'll see. I do want to mention one thing, which I say whenever I talk to people about this. I am completely hopeful and optimistic that we won't face this cataclysm, that it won't be a tremendously, disastrous change that will happen overnight, and that we will actually wake up as a society to what we're doing and how we can fix it in time for us to prevent it. That's really my belief, and that's what I plan to do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I'd be stocking up on guns. But it is very important to plan even for the worst case scenario. It's, how did they say? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, or probably hope for the best, plan for the worst. I really do think it's possible to avert a very big disaster that could happen. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do with I and everyone else with this podcast and with the ecoVillage model in general. It's to attempt to get this information out to as many people as possible to allow us all to transition smoothly into a much more harmonious and healthy way of living for everyone. And so that's really my personal belief and goal. However, if at some point society suddenly wakes up to the fact that the oil has run out and that we can't eat or can't drink anymore, I'd very much like to be prepared to be able to provide, for my son and for my family, everything that we need, basically. And so, I don't know what will be. I don't know how, if you ask me honestly, I'm late. I'm like, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes late, 15, 20 years late to where I'd like to be in terms of how close we could be to, to facing disaster. But I'm trying to get everything done in time. We'll see how close we make it. But honestly, the one of the most frustrating things for me is that all of these problems that I've talked about, and all of the problems that I'll talk about next show, all of the dangers that as a society we can face are all preventable. And that's something that I really strongly, I'd like to say no, but I'll say believe. Because I've seen it. I've seen how so many problems that people deal with on a day-to-day basis already have solutions. Somewhere, someone has thought of the exact solution for that. And so it's very frustrating to watch us as a society deal with all of these things, and people saying, oh, what are we going to do? And, if we don't do something quick, it'll be too late. Where really, there is a lot that we can do if we just pull ourselves together. So sorry, that's a bit might be a bit soppy for such a talk, but I think it's important to end on a positive note. Oh, thank you, Stevie QA. I try to be. I try to be. I'll tell you what, honestly, I went through a long bout of depression, serious depression, about the fact that the world is going to end. That people are completely oblivious to the dangers and the fact that we're committing suicide on a global level. And I really didn't know what I could possibly do. And that caused me a great deal of pain and suffering. And then, well, not then, but after many, many years of dealing and trying and finding and etc., I discovered, came across, I was told about the ecoVillage model, obviously under another name, and I started both researching and thinking about it. And it really came together so quickly as, I mean, I hate to say it, it sounds so fake, but this really is how I feel. It actually is a solution to all of humanity's, let's say, global problems. This isn't going to, solve your problems of communicating with your girlfriend. Although, actually, it might because of the, what do you call it? The communication. Oh my gosh, the name has completely escaped my mind. The method of communication that we're going to be using in the ecoVillage. It'll come to me in a minute, sorry. But yeah, basically that as a society, we really can solve all of these problems that we're facing today. We just have to sort of change a lot of the way that we're doing things. That I think is a key point. Okay, wow, I've missed so much of chat. I think a lot of it was chit-chatting. Oh, wait, why can't Krim go to sleep? Now I'm interested. I'll go over it afterwards. Yes, it's interesting what you say, Kyle. That only smart people get depressed. I don't think only. I think maybe there's a certain type of depression that only smart people get. But certainly in my experience, people who think rather more than the average person tend to get rather depressed rather quickly. That could have something to do with the situation that we seem to be facing in the world today. But nevertheless, it's certainly something that everyone, I think, who is aware of what's going on has to deal with it. But personally, I think that the solutions and the optimism is something that so often gets overlooked, and it's certainly a lot easier to show the problem than to find a solution. So I think this is why it became so important to me when I came across this thing, when it was told to me, etc., that this is something worth getting out there. And if you have any friends or know any people who are unaware of sustainability and different technologies and methods that are out there, then by all means, I really think it's a service to share this information with others and to tell them, there's actually a strain of mushrooms that can clean up, mercury that's spilled in the forest. Like, really? Wow, yeah, check out this video by Paul Stamets, 6 Ways Mushrooms Can Save the World. And people are completely surprised by the things that I tell them when they haven't heard of these things, as obviously I was before. I'm learning all of these things along with everyone, and I still get surprised by just how incredible the natural world is in being able to solve some of our problems. So I think it's really crucial that we get to know these things, get to realize that there's going to be some changes we have to make in order to see better days. But if we do that, then I really think we will see those better days. Let's see. Yeah, chat is completely off the rails, Rondon. I missed the whole thing about Steemit IQ's profile. I apologize, but I'll run it through later. Kyle says high IQ folks that are aware are certainly show more predisposition to get depressed. Yeah, I think that depression is really a sign of, well, it may be a nice way to tie in the beginning and end of the show, but it's a way that we see resilience come into play, where that depression is a result of being exposed to a certain part of the environment, a certain truth, which is uncomfortable, which is, changes something that was there before, which usually takes away at least comfort. And if we deal with that depression honestly and openly, I believe, and this was my experience and a lot of people I know, certainly once we sort of leave our 20s, we do seem to grow from that initial depression where we used to be children who had no depression, and then we became depressed at the world and we sort of lost our happiness. But the happiness or the acceptance that we got from that depression actually made us fuller people because of it. I shouldn't be talking in plural. I should be talking about myself, because that was my experience at least. But I certainly feel that if I could go back and take a magic pill that would make all of my depression go and I'd never have to deal with it, I wouldn't want to take it. I think it's given me a lot in my life. Rondon says depression is the result of not achieving goals for the most part. It's more complex than that. I see what you mean. I mean, saying not achieving goals is a it can be a very, very general thing. For me, not fulfilling myself or not finding my place in society or feeling that society was a lie definitely ties into me not being able to achieve my goals and me not feeling, not finding any goals really. So I think there's a lot to do with that as well, definitely. Or being aware of how fucked the world is definitely another reason to be depressed. But I would like all of you to remember that although the world seems to be a very depressing place right now, and I think it's easy to find something new and interesting to be afraid of. In fact, my next show will be mostly about the new and frightening things that we need to be afraid of. But yeah, exactly. Steven IQ is getting depressed reading this chat. We do need to remember that ultimately, I'll put it like this from a very, very personal experience that I've had. Right now, I have a perfect life. I mean, I can't describe it any other way. I have the means to be at home with my family, fulfilling my dream, doing what I've wanted to do. It's literally as perfect as it can get. And yet, I sometimes get depressed or upset. I sometimes feel that everything is going to hell and nothing is going to work out. And I think the fact that that happens is a clear sign that depression and optimism are not interconnected with the reality around us. But it's actually something that can be more developed from us within. So when I feel depressed, that's because I am feeling depressed right now, not because something outside is making me depressed. And if that's the case, then the vice versa is also true. When I find optimism in the situation, that's really up to me. And obviously some situations will be easier to find optimism in than others. But nevertheless, in my life, I see when I come across, challenges, I can view them as obstacles, view them as something bad, view them as something that's going to stop me now. Or I could view them as something that will help me grow and improve and be optimistic about the fact that things ultimately not only are going to work out, but really worked out already. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I've been Olev. I think I'm out of time just now. Thank you for joining the show, and I'll see you all next week.